Political choices and social change in higher order education. I'm a teacher. I'm a faculty at a public university, the largest one in the country, California State University, and I teach at Dominguez Hills. This is where we're going, at least in this conversation. I'd like to start with how the system of higher education works, and from a systemic point of view as a set of relationships. Second, I'd like to talk a bit about the stressors on the system that will result in structural change. And then finally, how the culture wars play out in the election and their impact on the system of higher education. So some theory. Higher education is an open system. And for those who might not be familiar, the difference between open systems and closed systems is that an open system is a series of relationships connected to its environment or context. It was the pioneering work of Ludwig Bertalanffy. Second, the system is a dissipative structure, and this is the work of Ilya Prigogine. And he imagined a system as relationships balanced on a knife edge, maintaining stability, and his term, far from equilibrium, because he wanted to distinguish it from the status or the static equilibrium. So it's balanced on a knife edge, and the thing that keeps it balanced are feedback loops. So everything is nice and it just sits there until something happens. Excuse me a second. When I teach, I usually teach students that are totally focused on mechanistic organizations. So I put this up as an example of one of the last times we had a pandemic and the relationships that existed throughout, and how complicated it all is. Chaos theory and nonlinear systems talk about when a system is perturbed or irritated, it falls apart. And the effect is not linear. So small random events sometimes destabilize systems and sometimes they don't. So a random event strikes the system and nothing happens. And then another one strikes the system and nothing happens. And then another one strikes the system and the system starts to fall apart. The key here, I believe, is that what happens next is not predictable. It's the butterfly effect. So with that, let's map higher education. And I'm doing this for higher education at the local level, not higher education with Betsy DeVos and her, no, I better not say that. In order to do this, I used cultural historical activity theory. and a heuristic that um, came from Vygotsky and was continued by his um, uh, successors. And it's a way of using this heuristic to evaluate what's happening in dynamic systems. Cultural historical activity theory, called CHAT, is used to analyze human systems. The basic unit of study here is the historically located cultural system. And it consists, in my world, and from what I'm talking about today, it consists of subjects, which are teachers, objects, which again, in my world is a business program because I teach in the College of Business. Rules, the institutional policy and regulations, also the cultural norms and the financial framework of how this system functions. The community is the teachers, the administrators, the department chairs, and the students. The tools are technology, also teaching strategies and communications. And what Vygotsky talked about when he talked about division of labor, I'm talking about in terms of academic technology and information and communications technologies. So this is what higher education on the local level looks like. It is a system. It is stable, far from equilibrium, and it takes a significant amount of perturbation to make it move. So on the left is the subject, which is the individual faculty member, and how he relates to his department colleagues and also to his students. And this has typically been a face-to-face environment. So the faculty member, his domain is the classroom and the interaction in the classroom. Since we're here talking among fielding alums, it's very different than the fielding environment of distributed education. This is the world of face-to-face interaction. So students expect to meet their faculty, they expect to interact with their faculty, and for things like research, for cultural norms, the interaction among the rest of the faculty. The rules are institutional policies and cultural norms, the artifacts of education. Division of labor in this system at this time, department chairs, associate deans, and the administration. And then finally, the outcome is the learning objectives. Does the student learn what he needs to learn in order to go out into the world and be the kind of human being we all hope that our students become? So I've been functioning in this environment for 22 years. And it hasn't moved noticeably since then. And then along comes COVID-19. And talk about um, a small perturbation. There's an invisible perturbation. Um, and the relationships in the system have become ruptured. Some over 2 or 3 months, some of them instantaneously. So the rules changed. We can no longer go on campus. So the faculty needs to figure out how it's going to function in this environment, and it has to do it in a week. The community changed. So the relationship of the faculty and the students and the faculty and the rest of the academic community, it appears to be gone. The relationship of the tools, the technology, both the academic technology and the physical technology has dramatically changed. So you have a system that has been seriously perturbed, and it is moving toward chaos. And what happens next? It starts to somewhat stabilize. So now the faculty has to interact with the students through mediated by technology. It has to interact with the business program through technology. The rules and policy, well, the cultural norms have been ruptured and don't know where they're going. But things like graduation ceremonies, the artifacts of culture are gone. And then along comes Black Lives Matter and Title IX. And there is, first in the lower right, a rising demand for multicultural education. So if we go back to the subject, the faculty for a moment, the demand for multicultural education is providing perturbations in the business program itself, and also in the faculty, who are now much more sensitized to what they're saying, how they're saying it, their reaction to their students. All the while, this whole conversation is taking place mediated by information and communication technologies and learning management systems. And this is a system that is, again, under pressure politically to go back to doing what it's been doing. And if you buy systems theory and chaos and complexity theory, that's never going to happen. It is destabilized, and it's going to come back sometime, some way. And then there's politics. A growing partisan divide in this country over education. A recent Pew report claims 60% of Republicans believe that colleges have a negative effect on the country. A New America poll found that among Democrats, 79% said colleges have a positive impact on the country. How do Americans feel about higher education? It depends on whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. Democrats report having a great deal of confidence in higher education than do Republicans by a 50 to 26 margin. It also depends on whether you're a liberal or a conservative. Liberals are more likely than conservatives to have a great deal of confidence in higher education by 45% to 25%. And for me, this was the oddest of them all. It depends on what term you use. So if you're talking about higher education, you get higher levels of confidence than if you substitute the term higher education with colleges and universities. Words used to describe higher education apparently make a difference. And then there's the conversation about who pays. Most colleges, many colleges, receive some governmental funding and generate revenue through endowments, but most rely on student tuitions and other fees for operating costs. The university where I teach survives on large doses of money from the state of California. While some people choose not to attend college because it doesn't appeal to them, the high price tag of higher education has made the endeavor prohibitively expensive for others. So even though we're a public university and our tuition is low, our students still struggle. In many cases, students and their families make significant sacrifices to cover the cost of tuition, room and board, textbooks, and other expenses. And that's the history that I come from. My parents struggled to make sure that I could go to school, and the state of New York allowed me to go to school. It obviously has made an enormous difference in my life because, unlike my father, I'm not an auto mechanic these days. Throughout the 20th century, many Americans believed that a college degree would enable them to obtain high-paid employments. By the 21st century, however, rising tuition costs, limited employment opportunities, ballooning student debt have led to some question about the value of higher education. Following cuts in state funding, some colleges and universities have been forced to close, to consolidate in order to cut costs. And they're in a balancing act between expanding academic offerings and improving student success, and at the same time, more affordable tuition rates. All of this is made worse by COVID. The good news, half of all Americans believe they can still get an affordable college education. The average American views higher education as a worthwhile investment. 80% of Democrats say the federal government should assume much of the funding of higher education. A majority of Republicans, on the other hand, say students and their families should be responsible to pay for their own education. Free college for all is supported by 3/4 of Democrats and opposed by a majority of Republicans. Conclusions: higher education is a system, and it's being severely perturbed. Where it will finally end up is still unclear. Perturbations at the local level so far include COVID-19, Black Lives Matter, and alternative educational delivery systems. So people are not convinced that they can get an education with alternative educational delivery systems. The ultimate impact of all this is also still unclear. Learning management systems like Blackboard, information and communication technology like what we're using now, these perturbations affect how faculty teaches and how students learn. How well students and teachers perform in this new and developing system mediated by technology is evolving, but it's critical. And on a national and state level, the growing partisan divide impacts decisions about funding higher education. Elections matter. The 2020 election will further perturb the system, no matter who wins. Thank you very much for listening, and my contact information is here should you wish to engage further. And okay, our next presenter is Steve Hasson. Hasson. I'm sorry. We just met each other 2 weeks ago. And Steve is going to talk about the cult of Trump, as well as, I believe, his research. So without further ado, I will give you Steve Hasson.
Thanks very much, Jim, and thank you for the opportunity. I'm Steve Hasson. I'm a licensed mental health counselor. I'm here in Boston, Massachusetts. I've been working in the area of cults and mind control and unethical influence for 44 years, since being deprogrammed from the Moonies. And I'm not yet an alumni, but I'm a wannabe, but I was invited to participate, so thank you. I had to take a year out to write The Cult of Trump for Simon & Schuster, which is scheduled to come out in paperback in September. So I'm not going to, I have PowerPoints, which I'm going to share in a second, but I really like talking and not doing PowerPoints as much as I can to interact with folks. What I want to say is that I believe cult mind control is one of the better explanatory frameworks for understanding the Trump presidency. And to back that up, I have lots of people who are former administration officials who've read The Cult of Trump who agree with me and who have spoken out about it. I want to state completely that I feel like we're at war from Russia, from outside, as well as from powerful authoritarian forces inside the country. And the thesis in my book is that not only does Trump have the stereotypical profile of cult leaders, which is malignant narcissism, which I will show you some slides in a moment, but that there are actual cults that are influencing Donald Trump and that are in his base. The so-called white evangelical base are actually mind control cults whose leaders are telling them that Trump is been chosen by God and they're in a war against Satan. I'll just name a few groups right now. We'll get to the slides in a second. But have you ever heard of a group called The Family? Michael Pence was recruited into it by Chuck Colson. It's a cult that's been operating in Washington for 80 years. Jeffrey Charlotte wrote 2 best-selling books on this cult. And there's a Netflix series called The Family, a 5.5 hour special. I highly recommend watching it. This is a cult that recruits Democrats, Republicans, atheists, Muslims, dictators, because they want power and wealth. And this is a cult that needs to be outed no matter who wins the election. They've been around for a really long time. Opus Dei is a Catholic right-wing cult that I've counseled people out of. William Barr is on the board of directors of Opus Dei in their prelature in Washington, D.C. So if you're wondering about his religious, ideological commitments and undermining rule of law, we need to think about the ideological bubbles that these cults are operating from. One of the scariest cults, which is actually a network of cults, is I call New Apostolic Reformation. I don't call it, but that's what they're called. And these are mega churches, a bunch of them, but they have leaders who call themselves apostles or prophets who get direct revelation from God, and they cast out demons, and they protect all their members from demonic possession. And they have very high tech, lots of money, and they do faith healings. They're the ones that will have Trump come and speak without masks and sing songs. New Apostolic Reformation. And then there are groups that are aligned called Dominionists, Seven Mountain Dominionists. And this, unlike Christianity, they want to take over the earth. And Mark Burnett, who is the producer of The Apprentice, is the head of one of these seven mountains. He introduced Trump when he was first elected at the National Prayer Breakfast. I forgot to mention that with the family. They're the ones who do the National Prayer Breakfast for 80 years. Mark Burnett introduced Trump. Then we have the Jewish right wing. We have the NRA. We have the neo-Nazi white power groups. We have Putin at the top of chapter 7. And don't get me started about Russia, but Putin is a dictator. He's a cult leader of a country. Kim is the cult leader of North Korea. So don't think of religious cults. Think of authoritarian pyramid structured groups. And I'm going to pop to my share screen. This one's this. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Good. Thank you. How do I show view slideshow? So this is Moon, my former cult leader, getting crowned the Messiah at the Dirksen Senate office building a number of years ago. By the way, for those of you who don't know what the Moonies are, he's a fat Korean billionaire with gun factories that when I was in the cult, I was told that democracy was satanic and that we needed a theocracy to rule the world. And I was groomed as a leader under him. He's best known for his mass weddings of telling members you're going to marry this person, this one, this one. Whether you speak the same language or not, it didn't matter. He started the Washington Times, owns the UPI, a billionaire cult group, even though they have been out of the media as exposed as a cult group, they're still very present in right-wing politics. 2 slides on malignant narcissism. Very briefly, you've heard this probably ad nauseum. Grandiose self-centered behavior, fantasies of power, success, and attractiveness, need for praise and admiration, sense of entitlement, lack of empathy. That's the narcissism side. And in chapter 3 of The Cult of Trump, I compare him directly with Jim Jones, Hubbard, head of Scientology, and Moon, and a few other cult leaders. And then for the malignant side, this is from Eric Fromm. That was his formulation, by the way, malignant narcissism. The antisocial behavior where the person thinks they're above the law, the pathological lying, the exploitation, the sadism, the harassment and silencing of anyone who disagrees or criticizes, threats of violence. I can shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and everyone will still follow me. Use Second Amendment people can help with the Hillary problem. Paranoia and inability to trust friends. So Trump is not a healthy person, and we have to stop in the media expecting him to be normal. He's not normal. Let's get over it. For those mental health people who are on this, listening to this presentation, I just wanted to add this quick slide, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the American Psychiatric Association, with the emphasis on identity disturbance. And it literally talks about coercive persuasion, brainwashing, thought reform, indoctrination while captive, torture, long-term political imprisonment, recruitment by sects or cults or terror organizations. So when I was in the Moonies, my real identity was suppressed and my cult identity took control and suppressed it. And in chapter 9 of The Cult of Trump, I talk about using this model to think about fanatical Trump true believers. And instead of treating them like stupid, ignorant people who are dangerous, I want to encourage people to think that they could be unduly influenced and given an ideology that is completely destructive and foreign. And this is one of the more important slides of my work. It's on my freedomofmind.com website, but it's an influence continuum where I want people to understand and distinguish between ethical, healthy do influences and unhealthy, unethical influences. And so a healthy group will tell you up front who they are, what they believe, and what they want from you before they ask for a commitment. Cults will lie, incrementally get you deeper and deeper involved. Will use hypnosis and other mind control techniques. I'll get into the bite model in 1 second. But it's all about performance. It's all about obedience and dependency to this pseudo identity, which is being controlled, versus the healthy side, which has your authentic self, compassion, conscience, creativity, free will, and humility, etc. And for the sake of time, I'm going to speed through. I don't have too many more slides, and then I can talk a little bit more. But basically, what helped me get out of the Moonies was a deprogramming after a near-fatal van crash, where my father asked me to meet with ex-members to prove that I wasn't brainwashed. And I was 100% sure I wasn't brainwashed, that I knew that Moon was God's agent on Earth. But I wanted to prove him wrong, so I listened. And one of the things that helped me the most was Robert J. Lifton's work on Chinese communist brainwashing in the 50s. He referred to it as thought reform, where he outlined 8 criteria. So his model was central to me starting to go, wait a minute, the communists do that? We do that in the Moonies. This does not compute. They're atheists, we're God-centered, but we're doing the same types of techniques. What I evolved from Lifton and another military intelligence official who is studying Chinese brainwashing, Margaret Singer, is what I call the bite model of mind control. And I took Festinger's 3 components, the central part of cognitive dissonance theory, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and I was able to organize a list of different qualities, specific behaviors in each of these that typifies destructive mind control. So for example, under behavior control, controlling your sleep, controlling your food, controlling your clothing, where you have to ask permission, where there's lots of behavior modification techniques. So there's a whole list. And for this presentation, I didn't want to give you 12 slides, but I'm happy to email it to you, or you can just come to freedomofmind.com under Learn About Undue Influence, and you can see the entire list. Under information control, oops, wrong way. Under information control, deceptive recruitment, outright lying, distorting, withholding vital information, having people spy on each other, confessing. So there's a whole laundry list of unhealthy information control tactics. And then we have thought control techniques. The ideology is the truth. It's not a map. Teaching the truth is the truth. Thought stopping techniques that people are taught. Loaded language, that's a term Lifton developed. So words like fake news or enemy of the people or libtards or cult of Soros, etc., all part of this black and white, all or nothing, good versus evil frame. Emotion control is basically destructive cults want to make you feel special and chosen and the saviors, but it's all about guilt and fear. And the universal mind control technique is phobia indoctrination, the implantation of irrational fears that if you don't do what the leader says and you don't do what the ideology says, disaster is going to happen. Now, if you're a religious person and you're Christian-esque, you're not going to be saved. You're not going to go to heaven. These are the last days. You're going to be in hell. You're going to burn. But there are thousands of different types of phobias, but they're all meant to take away choice. Because the thing about a phobia is it's not a real fear. It's an irrational fear. And Trump uses fear all the time. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just say a few more things that I think are vital. How am I doing on time? I've been trying to talk fast.
2 minutes.
2 minutes. So I want to talk about fourth generation warfare. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of fourth generation warfare. So it was a term developed in the 80s by an American military strategist named William Lind. And instead of doing PSYOPs, psychological operations, on the enemy to get them to believe your way, it's to undermine leadership, undermine institutions, undermine science, undermine truth. It's meant to disorient, confuse, overwhelm. And Russia has been doing this with thousands of agents infiltrating specific special interest groups in the United States to turn us against each other. Why? Because they want to have more power. They want to diminish NATO. They want to take over countries they lost when the Soviet Union left. Putin wants his money back that the Magnitsky Act took back. There's many different reasons, but then there's the fossil fuel people, the Koch brothers. Putin also has most of his wealth in fossil fuels. They want to keep promulgating that it's a hoax. So the election, even if Trump is defeated, this isn't over yet until we identify the structural cults that want to undermine separation of church and state, democratic processes. And for me, the only answer, big answer, of course, this is my specialty, is for all citizens to be educated about what destructive mind control is, how to protect themselves and their family and their loved ones, how to help people who've been already infected, how to help people recover. And my time is up, so I'll pass the baton. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Stephen. Next is Kristin Bollini, and her topic, change happens at every level of government. Kristin?
Thank you, Jim. And I'm really excited to be able to talk about this this topic because it's something that I've had an interest in for years. I am a political consultant, government affairs specialist, and have been for years. And it's frustrating to me the amount of time and energy we spend thinking about the presidency and with the amount of energy we put behind making sure we vote for president, and we don't think enough about the down ballot races and the, I'm trying to share my screen here. That was supposed to be a really smooth transition, guys. And that we don't spend enough time thinking about all of the structures underneath the president that need to change if we're going to enact the type of change that we want. So I understand that, of course, you know, the president is high profile. Certainly, this president has engendered a tremendous amount of emotion behind the things he's done. As we look at actions that are taken at the federal level that target vulnerable communities, the rallying cry behind making change at the national level is clear and understood. But don't get me wrong. My point here with this proposal and my interest in voting down ballot is really that this is not the only important decision we have to make. We have to look at where the rubber meets the road, and we have to make sure that we know and we're involved in choosing the leaders that are going to help us in our community enact the change that we want to see. So midterm elections are critical. We have a much, much greater turnout for presidential elections. US senators sit for 6-year terms. Our US House members sit for 2-year terms. Every general election cycle, you're going to have opportunities to vote for representatives in our US representatives. State governors generally run in midterm elections. State legislatures have varying term limits, but certainly they appear in midterm elections. In states where superintendents of public instruction are elected, these are critical. Mayors and city council members, county officials are often elected in the general election cycle, but not always, and that's a problem we'll talk about in a little bit. So to enact social change, we really have to focus on where the decisions are made and who's making them. So the United States has historically low voter turnout. So we have a mere, on average, 60% of the eligible voting population that shows up for a presidential election. That drops to about 40% when you look at midterm elections, or what I call down ballot races. And I thought I'd show you some demographics about who it is that's actually getting out to vote. You can take that 60% and that 40% and really look at who these folks are that are making the decisions that affect our communities. We all know that 60 and above vote at a much, much higher rate than the 18 to 29 age group. But in this graph, you can see that we're still seeing that spike in presidential elections and that lower turnout in midterm elections in every demographic. And so when I talk to younger people, and you know, we talk about, well, why aren't we spending more time at the national level talking about the affordability of college and student loans and some of the things that we care about? Well, we're spending a lot of time talking about Social Security because voters are older. That's what they care about. They've gone through school. Oftentimes they've sent their kids through school. It's not an issue that's coming up. And candidates tend to talk about, and electeds tend to talk about the issues that are important to people who actually get out to vote. So this is voting turnout by age. This is voter turnout by education. You can see a similarity in that pattern. And then voter turnout by race and ethnicity. And this is a much more compressed graph. We're not seeing the huge spikes, but we still see that same pattern. And we do see that non-Hispanic white voters vote considerably more actively in presidential and midterm elections. So what does that mean? Well, it means that voters are older, they're richer, they're more educated, and they're whiter than non-voters. And every time we have an election that we have low turnout in, we know that we're not getting a representative sample of the population. We're not getting a representative sample of the people who need to engage in a conversation about enacting change. So this is not a healthy democracy. So what's at stake in state and local elections? And I think sometimes we think a lot about federal policy and how important that is in our day-to-day lives, when in reality, so many decisions are made at the state level that are critical to us, and so many at the local level. So if you think about public transportation, if you think about infrastructure projects, if you think about addressing police violence and racism within law enforcement, and how do we fund and develop community-oriented social services that start changing that dynamic between policing and supporting communities. Those are setting that are happening at the local level. I did asterisk a couple of these, setting minimum wage and then setting minimum wage and then setting housing policies and renter protections, or instead of renter protections, landlord protections, as the case may be. So those are a couple of areas, along with a myriad of others, where we're starting to see state legislatures actually preempting city council's decisions around housing policies, renter protections, renters' rights, minimum wage, what has to be covered in terms of insurance by employers. So instead of allowing local communities to make those decisions, state legislatures are preempting those. They preempt requirement banning plastic bags. They have prevented cities and local communities from banning fracking, for example, or other resource extraction. So it's really important to balance state and local and be involved in both of those conversations and voting in both of those. Voting is something that I'm always amazed with, as fundamental as voting is to our democracy and our form of governance, that it is so disconnected and can be such a chaotic system to navigate. So states generally set voting policy. What ID do you have to bring to the polls? Are you going to be able to vote by mail? Are you going to be able to have someone who collects ballots and turns them in for you? Those are decisions that are made at the state level. But if you look at the actual administration of the vote, that happens generally at a city, town, county level. It's a local decision. How many polling places are we going to have? How many voting machines are we going to have? What is our voter assistance going to look like? All of those decisions are made by local governments. And if we're not involved in creating or developing the leaders in those local governments, then the ability to vote becomes difficult. I think we're all familiar with the failed primary in Georgia, where we saw people waiting in lines for hours. There were missing polling machines. There were broken voting machines. And communities of color were hit the hardest. Those are local government decisions, and those are local government responsibilities. And that is, that type of system that either in best case mismanagement and worst case malfeasance, that is voter suppression. And if we're not engaged in making the decisions around the people who are administering those elections and responsible for the administration of those elections, then we're really missing an opportunity. So how big is the problem in terms of local elections? Local election turnout is abysmal. So that 28.6% is an average of, that you'll see in that second bullet, is an average of a study of 340 mayoral races in 144 the largest cities in the United States. And the average voter turnout was 28%. I will tell you that it continues to decline as we spend more and more time and focus and energy at the national level. We have less time to focus at the local level. And so I wanted to give you an example, and I'm using very simple numbers because it makes my math easier. So how big is the problem? Well, if we assume that we have a city of 1 million people and that 60% of them are eligible voters, they're of voting age and they have their civil rights. If only 28.6% of that 60% are voting, we've got 171,000 people who get out to vote. So let's assume that it's not a super tight election and the winner gets 60% of the vote. And most of the time, local elections get much tighter, but the winner gets 60% of the vote. You still have roughly 10% of the population making this decision on who's going to lead that community and enact the social change you want for the other 90%. So if the stakes are so high, why don't we pay attention to local elections? Well, as we've seen local media outlets collapse, and we've seen more and more local media markets get gobbled up by national organizations, and we start to get our news from a national perspective, whether it's on Facebook or 24-hour cable news stations or webcasts, the conversation naturally coalesces around national issues, which takes the place then of the local issues that used to be reported by the press and considered by people. One of the most important of those is the conversation about policing the police and the Black Lives Matter movement. So while that's a national discussion and a national dialogue that has to occur at a national level, it's going to require local response. Policing is a local government function. So states are responsible usually for the departments of public safety. So your troopers that are out there on the highways, making sure you're not speeding. But the local police is governed. The chief of police is hired by city councils and mayors, and that's who they're accountable to. So if we want to enact change around police reform and community services that take pressure off the police for encountering folks who have substance abuse issues or mental health issues, and we want to provide more opportunity for folks in our communities, that change is really going to happen at the local government level. I did want to also highlight school board elections and bond proposals, because these have become a target. And honestly, if I had heard Steve's presentation prior to this, I probably would have added the family and Opus Dei to this list. But Americans for Prosperity, center-right and right-leaning groups, evangelical groups, some of the groups that Steve mentioned have realized that it's not just the national level that we need to change, that they want to enact the change that they want to see at the local level, because there's more sustainability to it there, and we're often growing our future leaders in that environment. And so school board elections and bond proposals that would lead to enhanced educational opportunities, anything that flies in the face of their philosophy, is something that they're going to get involved in and pay attention to. And I think it's critical that if these folks are paying attention, that we should be paying attention as well, and that we should be getting involved. And this is a Kristin quote. So you know, when we ignore what's happening at the local level, we're allowing big outside interests, often with a lot of money and a lot of power, to come in and tell local communities what's right for them. And they are every day enacting the change they want to see in our communities. They're not enacting the change we want to see in our communities. The only ones who can enact the change that we want to see in our communities is us. And I went through that much faster than I thought I was going to. So that is the end of my presentation. And I will take off screen share, and there I'm back.
Our cleanup hitter, Don Jacobs, alias Four Arrows, from way down in somewhere in Mexico, I think.
Area to be undisclosed, huh, Jim?
All right. I'll be there tonight.
All right.
And he's going to talk about the indigenous perspective.
Well, thank you, Jim, and thanks to Kristin and Steve also for the presentations, and yours, Jim. I like to go at the end, and people often over the years have asked me to, because they know that from an Indigenous perspective, I often will go and take what you all said deeper. I think this is something I did originally with Jack Miller, who wrote the books on holistic education. And one of his quotes was that holistic education, it doesn't go as deep as Indigenous worldview. And we've written articles together about going deeper. So let me frame what I'm going to say in terms of taking the important things that Jim and Kristin and Stephen said and seeing if I can go deeper. Just starting with Jim, when you opened up, before you talked about the 2020 elections, you really brilliantly brought in the higher education component of it. It was so important for us who were in that business, or you guys as alums are using that as part of your venue in life. You see, I think I wrote down that you called higher education as an activity system. And I want to say yes, and I would call it a hegemonic system. By hegemony, I'm referring to the concept that was originally brought out by Antonio Gramsci when he was a prisoner in Italy, and he couldn't understand why people were doing the bidding of Mussolini without a gun to their head. And so ultimately, it's the policies that we assume are good for us all, but are really only good for the ruling elite. And I would say that, a lot of folks know that there is an email signature that I often send that is probably something that my administrators don't like a lot, but I'll read it to you. It cannot be accepted that the university is a place of enlightenment. One can only sneak into the university and steal what one can. And by the way, I consider the three of you great thieves in that way. To abuse its hospitality, to spite its mission, to join its refugee colony, its gypsy encampment, is to be in but not of. This is the path of subversive intellectuals in the modern university. So I think it's important for us as we go into this election of 2020 to realize the things that we are learning, even at a doctoral level, are not preparing us for the importance of the situation that we are in and that we will likely be in. You say, Republicans don't see the value of education like Democrats. It's because they understand what I'm talking about. And the Democrats don't. It'd be a really crude and simple way to say it. Because the Republican, and I'm talking about let's talk about the modern day, to use Steve's language, the Republicans that are in the Trump cult. And as we know, it's the majority of voting members. They understand this. And so for them, the education with its mavericks, like the four of us, who are spouting progressive ideas, that's sort of an annoyance. But the privatization of education all the way through isn't going to change with COVID. Talking a little bit about Steve's cult of Trump, it was interesting. I was going to open up my presentation, Steve, by saying, I want to talk about the death cult that Trump's administration is representing. Because I don't think it's enough for us, again, going deeper, Steve, I don't think it's enough. It's important, but it's not sufficient to know these parameters of Margaret Singer's work and yours, so that we can avoid ourselves being sucked into the Trump family, nor is it enough for us to know this stuff so that we can convince others. It might be too late for that. But it's not too late for us to realize what Tom Hartman, is a friend of mine, just recently said on one of his shows. How can you not consider that this current Trump administration is a cult of death? So I just wrote down just a few notes on the back of a paper. If we look at the number of people that the COVID-19 has killed so far, it is a fraction of the people that the Trump laws that he's passed in the past 4 years have killed. We're talking about oil pipelines being allowed to pollute rivers. The Section 401 of the Clean Water Act allowing toxins and reduce the EPA protections, looking at rollback of the endangered species, the making accidental bird deaths illegal, giving gas and oil companies control of large chunks of land, logging increase. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. These are the causes of pandemics. This deforestation, the accumulation of industrial livestock farms, all of this is now happening more under the COVID, even though there are few cities that don't have fog anymore because no one's traveling. Climate change problems have intensified in terms of carbon because the logging has continued, the oil has continued. And so what is it about this connection between educational hegemony and a cult of death? Now, from an indigenous perspective, this is not the first time for us. We can go and look at the history, and I just put out to my colleagues at Feeling a 5-minute video on the Trail of Tears under Andrew Jackson, and it was a genocidal. It was a existential thing for Indian people, not for others. The only real difference between the policies of Andrew Jackson and the subsequent president, and we can say in some other ways with the top trickle-down Reaganite administration, is really that now this is in your face, and it is, because of a variety of reasons, a more global phenomenon. So I would suggest that the things that you're saying, Steve, about the phenomenon of hypnosis are right on in this way. We need to understand how to do it, how to understand it and how to recognize it, because it's a natural phenomenon that authority figures use. All creatures during times of stress become hypersuggestible to the communication of a perceived trusted authority figure. Curtis Hall published my book on this, on emergency medical care. You go to a scene of an emergency and somebody is frightened and bleeding, and Kristin walks up to them, and with a lot of confidence, because she's got a lot of charisma, she walks up and she says, listen, I'm trained in this. The ambulance has been called, help is on its way, but you're hemorrhaging and I can't get this door open. When I count to 3, I want you to stop your bleeding. 90% of the time during the first hour post-trauma, the bleeding will stop. So she can save a life with this hypnosis. But as I say in my book, The Bum's Rush, in which I expose the hypnosis Rush Limbaugh has used to stop the environmental crisis, his fallacies and his strategies, hey, you want to use my pen or yours to sign the contract with, kind of double bind hypnosis, are one of the things that stopped the environmental movement in its tracks. And he was sponsored by Roger Ailes and in partnership with George Bush. So if we're going to know about hypnosis, yeah, let's know about it to stop cults. But let's know about it, how we can realize what are we doing to continue probably the worst cult that has been affecting us. And that is a cult that none of us have probably really accepted, and that I often get in trouble for saying, and that's the cult of crony capitalism that we live under. Oh, how can capitalism be a problem? Well, look at the slew of books that are starting to come out, that unlimited capitalism is impossible to not look at the quarterly report by definition of a corporation. And we've got a few indigenous-based cultures like New Zealand that have made people out of rivers, but mostly corporations are people. And under the capitalism, I wrote a book with a guru of Ron Paul named Walter Block. I invited him to write a book called Differing Worldviews, Two Scholars Argue Cooperatively. I said, we can't debate each other. We have to argue cooperatively. We've become, friends, strange bedfellows that we are. I gave a copy to Alice Walker, though, and she threw it in the trash and said I was in bed with the devil. But I disagree with that. So, but we did, we don't have the vitriol, but I can stand strong. You go on YouTube and watch our presentation at St. Louis University. It's put in 4 arrows of St. Louis University and Walter Block. But Walter believes deeply that only humans have intrinsic value. You cannot run a capitalistic society and believe otherwise. That's why this list of things I just led under Trump is demolishing Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, so everything, all the things causing the COVID in the first place, but they're gutted because that is a benefit to capitalism. If capitalists have to worry about polluting the river or killing the species, then it's a problem for their profit. So what can we do to take what Steve has taught about the cult of Trump, which he's totally right? What can we learn from this about our own involvement? And what can we learn about hypnosis, about things that we believe, because some authoritarian figure, maybe our mom, our dad, our preacher, the peddler, when we were young especially, that we continue to do. And what in higher education, with managerialism, with top-down, with competition, with letter grading, promotes capitalism but does not promote egalitarianism. The lack of inclusion, the opposite of inclusion is not exclusion. It's decolonizing. And all of these issues that are major issues, police brutality, racism did not exist before 1492. These are economic things related to this phenomenon. Now, am I promoting some other ism? No, but I'm saying that until we recognize these things, even though under the Trump administration, because of the fast track, we are dying a lot faster. And under Biden, it'll be a slow boil. But during that slow boil, and this gets to Kristin's part now, if we do what Kristin's saying, during that slow boil, there'll be enough of us to maybe turn things around, because it's got to be turned around at the local level. The policies, and you don't think that this has been known by the Republican Party? The Koch brothers, who feigned disagreement with Trump, but still supported him, you know what they were doing the whole time Trump was taking the stage while he was getting elected? They arranged for local judges to get hired. Local judges got the power you can't believe. So indigenous perspectives, we are political. We are successful, temporarily probably, with finally the Standing Rock, the pipeline. We got it stopped, but what's happened? The power of the other side was so strong, they said, we're not going to pull our oil out of it. What are you going to do about it? That's what the Supreme Court told Andrew Jackson told the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, you cannot force the Indians on the Trail of Tears. Andrew Jackson said, I got the cavalry. And it happened. This is going to probably happen under Trump. Why? Because we Democrats, we liberals, we higher education people are hypnotized by a system that we are unwilling and chastised for if we try to change. I think that was my 20 minutes. Thank you.
Nicely done. We have 15 minutes for questions.
I want to just say how honored I am to be part of this panel with you, Jim and Kristin. You are awesome. And 4 arrows, you bring me to tears.
Thank you, Steve. It's been a really good panel. Appreciate everybody on it. And thank you all for coming and joining us for this conversation. We hope it was beneficial to you and get you thinking about some things that maybe you hadn't thought about before, or start thinking about things in a different way.
Right. Thank you to everybody. And I really was honored to be with you all on this thing. And hopefully we'll do it again sometime.
Don't go yet. Let's do some questions and answers.
For sure.
Yes.
So does anyone who was listening? Because I can ask lots of questions if nobody was.
Trevor, do we have people set up for the raise their hand function, or what's their best way to ask a question?
We do have the raise your hand function. I'm thinking just with a smaller number in here, probably anybody that has a question they'd like to ask out loud can just unmute, and we'll kind of manage that informally. Sure.
Perfect.
Okay, I'm Margaret. Hi, and I will turn my video on so you see me. I had a number of questions. I raised them in the chat function, but I'm, as a Canadian like Trevor, I look at what's going on in U.S. politics, top, up, down, and I'm reading that already under Goldwater, and maybe 4 Hours could comment on that. Already then the Republicans had a strategy of infiltrating all levels of power by appointments, and one feels overwhelmed. And I scratch my head and I say, well, what can be done? I mean, I put a comment in the chat, the Electoral College is set up to be skewed in favor of Republicans. And I speak from ignorance because I'm not well versed in the American way, but that's my understanding. And it seems so overwhelming. And I agree, you start at a local level. But if you only have 10% turnout, shouldn't you look at the top and look at changing how it's possible that a popular vote is overridden by college? And I'm thinking of the last election where Hillary, not by much, but she gained a popular vote, but Trump did get in by virtue of the Electoral College. So it's a complex question, and feel free to jump in. It's more a scratching of the head. What do we do?
Well, Connie, I think you make an excellent point. The Electoral College is a historic. It's a throwback to a time that it was difficult for people to count votes and people were spread out. It serves no purpose anymore, other than the fact that it gives campaign consultants and candidates a path to victory. They know how to run a campaign for president within the Electoral College system. And the idea of running a popular vote campaign nationwide is so daunting, they don't want it to happen. So this is where political consultants come in, and they protect the turf that they've got, just like we do in any other area. People like a system they know, they like a system they feel like they can manipulate or control, or definitely have a strong hand in controlling. But I think the point that I was trying to make, and when you say, well, if it's only 10% of the voters that are voting in local elections, shouldn't we focus at the top? No, I think that's exactly why we should focus at the bottom. Because all of the issues that come up from local governments are now, in this age of social media and social dialogue, are becoming national issues and national conversations. And just think about the power of your vote if only 28% of the populace is voting. Your vote has a much, much stronger pull one way or another. And as I said, a lot of local races are very, very close. I do share your frustration with the Electoral College, and it is something that has to change, and that will continue to be a national conversation, but we can't wait for that to change in order to engage where we need to engage if we want our communities to look like and respond the way we want them to respond, and change the way we want to see them change.
And I'd like to jump in and just add, for me, the Koch brothers, by the way, the founder, I mean the father, the grandfather, started the John Birch Society. You want to know about the cult of free enterprise? This book is excellent. If you want to know about Rand Paul's ideological cult, this is another good one to read. But one scary thing that I learned was that the Koch brothers, had a long plan, and part of it was changing the Constitution itself by infiltrating states in order to get the votes, and they really, it's really a big thing. And to think about the globe, authoritarians who treat people like objects versus people who treat people like people, and the earth like a valued, precious habitat that we share. Those are the big worldviews as I see it, and I just love to death what all of you said.
Can we get to Kathleen and then Gwen and then Linda? Yeah,
Sure.
yeah, there you go.
Yep. I'm trying to frame my question, so bear with me a little bit. I just attended a session with the Higher Education Sustainability Initiative. And one of the speakers was the president of Arizona State University. And Arizona State is known as like the most innovative university and one of the largest in the States now. Some of the things he specified or mentioned as what one of the underlying issues within the education frame here, less in the political frame. He says basically it's us, that higher education is inadequate to meet the needs, especially the design limitations, that it's basically, and this is a blanket higher education, we are archaic, slow, non-adaptable, not intellectually sophisticated, not moving at the speed of climate change and complexification. And because of the inadequacies, one of the others then in not being receptive to change is a limitation in the amount higher education actually cares and takes activist positions. So I know that fielding is a little bit different, but still the idea that students come in and the goal is to graduate and leave and do something. But where can the universities, where can higher education really take on more of a sense of moral duty, responsibility as an institution to become more adaptable, basically, and more aware of their inadequacies? Big question. I mean, I was like trying to create it at the time, but I was really inspired by this. He is 5, and I can put in the link of this speech, but it really resonated. So if you can find a question in there, I'd love to hear comments.
What are you trying to do? Put us out of business, Kathleen?
No, I think, his closing of his speech was, we need you to shake it up. So I think my question is, how can we shake it up?
Well, here's my take on it, because I consider myself to be the tip of the spear, because I interact directly with students. So I think that this could take a while. I think that the interaction between faculty and students is crucial to what you're asking. One of my great complaints about higher education is that meaningless research is held in higher esteem than quality teaching. Now, no one in the administration is going to tell you that. They're going to tell you that our goal is to provide our students with blah, blah, blah. But if you look at the way organizations are structured, higher universities are structured, they are structured in the people who do the research get the goodies, they get the promotions, they get the kudos. The people who do the teaching are somewhat second-class citizens. And that's unfortunate because that's where change is going to occur. That's where change always has occurred.
Mhm.
It's small groups of dedicated people changing the world. Somebody said that. So that's my 2 cents. Don, you wanted to add something?
Well, look, Michael Crow is one of the really great scholars, progressive scholars. And no one thought he would get to be president of Arizona State because Arizona is a very conservative state. I know I was a tenured professor at Northern Arizona University and quit to come to Fielding because of it. Michael is on target on most things. I know that he feels that the linearity of education does not work in higher education, especially now with all the nuances of education. Him and I are in the business because we feel a lot of people still go to it, so we're trying to get the work done. But eco-versities, which is a large group now in the world, is kind of taking the step that probably Michael and I would do if we weren't trying our best to try to work within the system. Eco-versities are people that are saying the heck with paid education, the heck with tiered education, and what do you want to know, what kind of topics, and you go to these different places. We're in that kind of a world. I think that the goal of education, whatever it be, whether it's having, the degrees and the letters behind your name or not, is freeing up our ability to be productive, to get in control of our productivity and our ability. And that can't happen with elections. We should do election voting to minimize the danger. Like I say, the slow boil is not going to stop, but we can minimize the explosions, which are happening now. But while that's happening, we can't put our faith in any of it. We got to put our faith into building and maintaining food sovereignty. We got to be maintaining and building energy sovereignty and water sovereignty. And if we start doing that, like eco-versities people are doing in different places all around the world, then I think we have a chance, but it's going to require courage. It's going to require resistance. But if everybody's doing it, then any autocracy, is not going to happen. It's going to be like the overthrow of Milosevic. When millions and millions of people walked up to his government office, and you had literally 1,000 armed soldiers ready to get him. They all went, "Hey, Uncle Charlie, I'm your nephew. Hey, brother, what are you doing there?" Right? And pretty soon everybody put their weapons down and they took it over for a while. So this is not going to be easy.
Hold it a second. I didn't want this to end without giving Gwen and Linda an opportunity to ask questions. Gwen?
I don't know that this is very feasible to answer in the time, but when I was listening earlier about the Trump being associated with a cult of death, and I am a Canadian. I watch from the outside in many ways, and yet we're so intricately tied with the U.S. Using an example, something like wearing a mask and social distancing that makes so much sense from a scientific perspective. I look at the states from my perspective and think, how is this ever going to be reconcilable? Because there seems such a great divide. And, you know, there's some great videos that are out there that show the perspectives of people who are pro-Trump on issues like this. And I guess I wonder, what's the leverage point? What could be a tipping point to change things? Because from the outside, it's really scary. And in many ways, it looks really hopeless.
So my 2 cents is to say the former members can become the most effective influencers to people who are still in the cult, and we're seeing a bunch of Republicans. I see Don is sharing something. So
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
okay, I'll keep it short. No, but there is hope, but it's going to take strategy, in my opinion, and resources and messaging. We understand media has 6 conglomerates, and they're top down, as Don was, as Four Arrows was explaining. There's censorship. So there's so many structural things that need to change. But ideally, it's the people power, back to what you were saying, Four Arrows, about people reaching out to their family members and friends who are Trumpers, who are saying, no, it's my freedom to not wear a mask. Hey, bro, I love you. You wear a seatbelt. Like let's live.
Linda?
Yeah, so a couple of points. First, when I left fielding, I finished in 1999 and decided to change careers and decided to get into politics. I actually spent the years of 2001 to 2005 as chair of the state Democratic Party. So I was able to look at the system from the inside and see what some of the levers were that could change the system. We've talked a little bit about the Electoral College and how important it is, but to change it, you have to pass a constitutional amendment, which means 2/3 of the states need to ratify whatever the amendment is. It's a long-term process. And so while it may be commendable to go after that, I try to look at what can we have influence on more quickly. Hillary Clinton won Wisconsin, or lost Wisconsin, 4 years ago by about 22,700 votes. I can think of ways to turn out 22,771 people for her to win the state in Wisconsin, in Michigan, and Oregon, Ohio and Pennsylvania. How do we look at things in a way that we can have an impact on them and make a systemic change? One of the things I did more recently was get involved in, and actually I was part of the original team that took the Gill v. Whitford redistricting case to the United States Supreme Court. We lost that case. They ended up saying, they took it, they actually listened to it and heard our case. They ended up saying that this wasn't a justiciable issue. But what we also did around the state of Wisconsin is that you can now go to just about any community and they can tell you exactly what partisan gerrymandering is and how it impacts them, because we made it a statewide education effort. We took it to the people and they started really developing the process to overturn that and to make a different process for calling district lines. So I guess my point is, how do we look at this as a systems issue? Four Arrows talked about Antonio Gramsci. The Koch brothers and the Bradley brothers, who are actually based here in my state, based some of their work off of Antonio Gramsci's theory that it's the institutions that matter. And they went in and started taking over the institutions and working to impact them. How do we take that kind of strategic approach to actually create a better democracy?
Well, Linda, that is an absolutely excellent question, and I think you really hit the nail on the head. I mean, everyone who came to this session is politically woke. We all have communities that we influence. We probably all have people lists of people who call us and say, I don't know about this ballot proposal, or I don't know anything about that candidate. What do you think? So we have our spheres of influence. We just haven't, and to your point, what it takes is communities coming together and looking at the big picture. And I don't think that either party on a global perspective or national perspective has done a very good job at the strategy piece. So I think the Republican Party does a good job at specific strategies. The Democratic Party does a good job at their specific strategies. But there are a whole lot of big money outside groups that are thinking strategically. It's not the political parties that are doing it necessarily. And I do believe that, as Jim mentioned, small numbers of people doing great things are what's going to make the change, but how do we scale that? And is there a way to scale that through some of our university infrastructures? Back to Kathleen's comment about sustainability in universities. I mean, we've got infrastructures in universities. I mean, I'm in Michael Crow's backyard. We have conversations about, I represent community colleges. We do a lot of work with the universities, so I get to spend a decent amount of time with Michael. But how do we take the institutions that we have now that are politically woke and use them as mechanisms to educate and excite people about a variety of issues or about a specific issue? And that is, where are we going to stand in the Electoral College if we lose Wisconsin, or if we lose Pennsylvania, or if we lose one of these other states? And I just, I don't know why, but as you were talking, Linda, I was thinking about that connection between the activism that we need to see in our higher education institutions to enact the change we want, and this infrastructure that is already there. And how do we use the institutions we have to change the dialogue and to change the engagement of people? And that I don't know.
Marissa?
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to add on to the conversation with a thought and a question. As I listened to the three presentations, I really was thinking that there was an underlying theme of power, and how does power play into influencing change? When I think about power, one of the drivers I always think through is, follow the money. Where is the money coming from? How is the money influencing power? I'm in the Washington, D.C. area. We've been talking for decades about the Washington Redskins team name. And it's only now that folks like Nike and huge other companies that are saying, we're not going to sponsor you unless you change the name. And so it's power, it's money. So how do we think about taking down these cults, changing bureaucracies without thinking about the money? I mean, I feel almost, I feel like all the groups that I am a part of that are very strong still don't have the level of money that all these other big corporations, Koch brothers, others have to really make a change.
Yeah, so I just want to name a few books, if I may, like Jane Mayer's book, Dark Money, Shadow Network by Ann Nelson, about the Council for National Policy, big money. There's a lot of wealthy people who are progressives, but they're not connected, and they're not thinking about this as a war. Like the Trump people did a coup, they did a war, and they're not just going to wait for an election. They're going to be doing dirty stuff, guaranteed 100%. And we need to prepare, like get the brainstormers of every dirty trick they would do if they were trying to keep Trump in power, and outflank them and outthink them. And I don't see that kind of strategy. It's very worrisome.
Well, I think that's what Linda was saying. And I like to just point out the possibility that Standing Rock was a model for that. It addressed the money. We got divestment movements. Donna Abramson from the First Peoples Worldwide did a major campaign. We showed that it was not profitable for oil companies to, to deal with the kind of protests that we were doing. We got 2 presidential administrations to reverse decisions. Now, I've said, a little bit pessimistically that even though we have won again in the Trump administration, we don't know if the courts are going to force them to do what they've been ordered to do or not. But let's assume that we won the battle at any rate. So why did we win it? I think just look at Standing Rock as a model for that.
I would like to maybe offer a dissenting opinion. It seems to me that part of the problem that we suffer from is we don't ask the right questions. I've been watching Black Lives Matter, and there's a lot of noise and a lot of smoke, and I understand that Black people don't really like to get shot at when they drive down the street. I get that. But the response to that is, well, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely welcome to march. Just don't break anything and be home by dark. And if that's what happens, nothing happens. So I wonder if instead of asking the question, how can we develop equality, that we maybe should be asking the questions that Kristin is asking, which is, how do we change the system? How do we perturb the system so that it falls apart? Because systems theory teaches us that it's not linear. You can't do A and B and then expect C. All you can do is A and B and then watch what happens. So, the perturbation of the system may be the approach, and the questions that we ask. The Republicans are asking the right questions. How do we stay in power? If we stay in power, we can get done what we want to get done. If we don't stay in power, we can't. The Democrats are busy asking, well, should we have health care for everybody? Should we fix the environment? And maybe that's not the question. The question is, how do we get back in power so we can do the things we need to do?
I think you make an excellent point, Jim, there. That's a very good point, because not asking the right question means you don't have the right goal in mind. If you don't have the right goal in mind, it's hard to get there. But I did want to add one thing onto Marissa's question. I agree with you. It's power that makes things change, but those power structures. So we have power structures that depend on voters to elect them, right? So that's a type of power structure. But we also have a Nike, who is a retail seller of shoes and other athletic equipment. They will be on the right side of issues. That's why they engaged on the name change. That's why they've engaged in a number of areas. Nike's more progressive or more of an advocate for things than some other companies, but we've seen divestment strategies work to take down and change a lot of things. So when a company feels that either retirement funds are no longer going to buy their stocks because the public doesn't like them and they're hearing too much from their members, or Nike's hearing that people have a jaded view of buying their shoes because of something they've done or haven't done, it really does change them. So there are ways to change the power structures and get involved such that a Nike ends up falling on the right side of history, because that's where they want to be. And whether it's altruistic or just to save their brand, the end result is the same. And that all takes organized people who are messaging to those who have the power to make those changes. So it's us not only looking at governments and elected officials, although they have a very big voice in this conversation, we're consumers and we vote with our dollars. And in this, era of social media, there's a lot of ability, again, to take local issues or to take what seem like singular issues that affect one community and make them national debates and have a national dialogue.
And with that, we have to go. I'd like to thank, on behalf of my fellow panelists, all of you for joining us, for contributing your voices, and for connecting us again with one of the great institutions in America, Fielding.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you again. It was an honor.
Thank you.
Take care,
It's a
everybody.
pleasure. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.